All right. Well, I'm delighted to be with you here today. I want to say, first of all, for those of you who are learning professionals, that what I'm going to do is not what I would do in the classroom. So in the classroom, I really do try to get people to come along to a point of view and hopefully elicit it from them. But I was told that for this, you really wanted to hear bang, bang, what to do. So I'm going to kind of switch it around in the opposite order. I decided I'd give you 10 predictions for 2028. And then I thought to myself, well, I can't just say 10 things and not tell you a little bit about why. So I squeaked in some why. And then I thought, and I really want to say a word or two about how, so I squeaked in a little of that too. So my apologies if I go a little fast. You will absolutely have the slides if you'd like them. We'll email them to you. But let me begin and tell you what I think are 10 things that will happen when we begin to deal with all of these issues we've been talking about. So we've heard about AI and digital, we've heard about demographic changes, we've heard about all of these kinds of things. So how do you respond? Here's what I think. The first two things are largely technology, but not exclusively technology driven. Here's my first thing I suggest to you: own less. And that means have fewer employees. So I'm going to include the full-time employee relationship as part of the subject of ownership. You should own less and you should have fewer full-time employees. By 2028, most companies will. So think about it this way. If you have roughly 5,000 employees today, by 2028, will you still have employees? I think so. And it'll vary by business how many those will be. But you might have, say, 2,000 or 3,000. And then you'll have a community, a broad community of people who contribute to what your organization is all about. Why do I say this? Well, the first reason has to do with someone that you may recognize. I don't know how many of you have seen this handsome guy before. But this handsome gentleman, one of my heroes, is named Ronald Coase. He wrote a fantastic book back in 1937 called The Nature of the Firm. The Nobel Prize Committee read it in 1991 and gave him the prize. Now, what did Ronald Coase say? Well, he actually made a pretty cool prediction. What he said back in 1937 was that there would be a relationship between the cost of communication or transactions and the amount of stuff that a company would own. What do you think that relationship is, by the way? In other words, if it's really expensive, you've got to get on your horse and buggy to go communicate with your suppliers and try to negotiate. Are you more likely to just buy those suppliers or to continue the negotiation? Do you own more if the communications are costly or own less? What do you think? The answer is actually more. That's what he predicted. And in fact, if you look back in history at, for example, the start of the automotive industry, one of the first things the Fords and the Morris Motors of the world did was backward integrate. They bought all their suppliers because communication costs were high, and frankly, it was a pain in the neck to try to negotiate with those guys to get the goods they needed, where they needed them, on time. So they bought them. Now, what happened in 1980? We get computers, and people began to put computers into their companies. What did people also do in 1980? So the cost of communication begins to fall with computers. What did people begin to do in terms of what they did within their firm boundaries? They outsourced. Yeah, they spun things off. And so in fact, I think the reason he got the prize in 1991 is the decade of the 1980s proved his theory. It showed that as communication costs fell, companies owned less. And my argument to you is that communication costs over the last decade have plummeted once again. And you have not taken advantage of it. But Mr. Coase predicts that you will. So over the next few years, you need to look at every single thing you own, all of your physical resources, but also your full-time employment roster, and decide how much of this should we own and how much of this should we tap into on some other basis. That's the first. The second reason that we need to own less is that with lower costs, we begin to move, just as Michael described, to more of a network model. Networks win when communication costs get low. In other words, owning stuff doesn't give you the same kind of economic return as having the ability to do the connections. As the connections are less expensive, then being at the hub of those connections is where the economic power comes in. This is a classic picture of a standard kind of business model where you have producers, you make something in your company, and you sell it to your customers. Today we call that a pipeline business, all in one direction. And of course, the wave of the future that we're seeing in industry after industry is to take advantage of this lower cost of communication to create more of a network basis, where you, in fact, in the center are the platform, allowing people to both produce and be on your platform and consume out of your platform on both sides. You're providing in the middle the network, the curation, the ratings, the trust that those give, the connections that you can provide. So it's about getting bite-sized opportunities, thinking about how could you break what you do down into bites, into pieces that different people could contribute to, whether we're talking about individual human beings, small corporations, big corporations. How do you create a way of breaking down your value chain so you can get those bite-sized pieces coming in? And then how do you want to curate and rate them in ways that those who end up purchasing from your platform will find adds that element of trust? Today, by the way, 7 of the top 10 valued firms in the world are platform-based. There's really not very much doubt that the idea that platforms are going to win. Here's a study that was done by some other professors where they looked at 4 different categories of ways that companies make money. One was traditional, they called it asset builders, where you actually are building something inside the company. The second was a service provider. They broke out technology providers in a special category because those do have slightly different economics. They didn't lump them in with the traditional asset companies. But then look at the network or platform companies. Very significantly different economics being achieved there. And the expectation is platforms going forward will win. Now, some of you are probably saying, yeah, but we're a big traditional firm, right? We're a big manufacturing company. We can't do a platform. Well, I think you should think about it. Here is one company that has gone platform. This is the Chinese company Haier. They make washing machines and refrigerators and so forth. They're a white good manufacturer. And they basically decided to turn into a platform. So they spun off all of their manufacturing into small entrepreneurial ventures. They created a platform at their level to provide the financing and, again, to provide the curation and rating and all of those kinds of things, the sense of security that their customers would want with the Haier brand name. And then the people who are running the entrepreneurial ventures are now paid based on performance. So the risk of performing to the higher standard is now borne by those who are running those entrepreneurial ventures. I think this is an unbelievably gutsy move. Will it work? Is it a model for what other companies should do? I don't know. And it certainly is going to the extreme. But the point is, people who are likely to win in the future, I think, are going to take some big bets. And here's a company that's decided to take a big one. So here's a bit on the how. I think starting immediately, you should look at all your resources. As I said, physical as well as employees. And you should decide, what does it make sense to own? There will be things you should own. There may be people, for example, who are so scarce that you absolutely want to employ them full time simply to keep them off the market so nobody else can touch them. But there's going to be a lot of other opportunities to tap resources in a much more flexible way, not always through conventional outsourcing. You do it in a whole variety of ways. I expect to see companies deciding to share a resource, for example, maybe even jointly hire a pool of people that I need sometimes and you need sometimes. All kinds of creative things we could imagine for how we would rent or share or borrow or barter different resources given these different economics. So embrace a whole variety of arrangements. Think like a platform. Think, how do I break down what I do into bite-sized pieces that other people could bid to be part of, could join in with me? And stop telling people to be agile and design an agile organization. One of my pet peeves is when we use words like agility or collaboration as something that we want human beings to be. Well, we sort of want them to be that, but the reality is being agile means giving you choices. I've got to design a system where you have some options. And if I design a system where you can create choices and make different options based on what you see in the marketplace, you're going to be agile. That's what it takes. So as leaders, we have to think about designing agility into our organizations. Everybody okay? Yes. I'll take a breath. Okay, here's number 2. Plan less. And you should plan less for 2 reasons. I'm going to tell you both in a second. But by plan less, I basically mean just get in the real time. Access what you need when and where you need it. Be more in the moment. Stop long-range planning. I think going forward, by 2028, we're going to see a lot less planning going on. Work processes are going to be redesigned to use real-time coordination of assets, and experimentation is going to replace strategic planning as a major decision-making tool in corporations. Why do I say this? 2 things, 2 whys. The first one is that digital really changes how we do things. Adam mentioned I've done a lot of work studying different generations, and one of the fascinating things about studying young people is to watch how they get stuff done. And unconsciously competent users of digital technology do stuff in ways that are different than those of us who learn to use digital technology as adults. So let's just play with an example, okay? Now, as you can probably tell, I'm pretty old. So you can imagine I'm one of these ladies up here with a pillbox hat, okay? Tell me how I would go about the process as an old lady of having lunch with one of my old lady girlfriends. How do old ladies have lunch with a girlfriend? What do I do? What would I do? I would ring each other up. Yes, we'd call. When would we do this? Weeks in advance, absolutely. Now, here's the important part. What would we get to on our phone call? Where would we end up? Date, time, place, type of food, who's going to drive, what we're going to wear, right? We would have made a plan. Yes, old people plan. People plan. Now, think for a moment about this young lady, okay? How's she going to have lunch with a girlfriend? What's she going to do? Text, WhatsApp, right? Or look at some, yeah. I'm here, right. When is she doing all this? Not just the day. Now, yes. In fact, you've probably read about Pavlov, who's done research on dogs. Well, he found out that when dogs are hungry, they drool. My research would say when young people are hungry, they text. This is the new Pavlovian response, okay? So she texts or WhatsApps or takes an Instagram or whatever. Now, what's in it? What's the content of hers? Bingo, exactly. You are spot on. It is a location-based communication. She would communicate either her location, they would communicate their location. They would then begin a process like ships using radar of homing in on each other until they end up at the same place. But at no time during that would they have planned. Okay? This is an example of what's going to come to your company. Now, what do I get when I plan? What advantage did I have when I planned my lunch? Security about what? I know what day, yes, I know it's at a restaurant I want to go to, I know I'm having it with a person I presumably wanted to see. What are the disadvantages? Right, if things change, I have very little flexibility, right? What if my boss says to me, Tammy, you've got to work through lunch? Or what if I'm not feeling well and I don't want to eat lunch? Now my friend is driving in from the countryside, incurring all kinds of costs. And here I am stuck with this inflexible plan. What advantage does she get when she coordinates her lunch plans? What does she get? She gets an opportunity for what? Okay, so she might have lunch with somebody she didn't even know was in town. It's a pleasant surprise. She, of course, gets to do it when she wants to do it, when she's actually hungry. She doesn't have to do it if she's not hungry. So it becomes much more finely attuned to the specific needs of the situation. These are the characteristics you need to think about in your corporation. Now go back to your processes and say, where is it so important that we have Joe on the 15th of the month that I need to plan for it, versus there's a bunch of people who can do it and I can just wait and see when I really need them and tap them as needed. That kind of feel of coordinating versus planning is what you need to bring into all of your business processes. Yep, some. And so you're going to have to think about it in terms of where the risk is greater one way or the other. For example, is there a risk with Uber that there are no cars available? I suppose so. Doesn't seem to be a huge problem, and you probably have to have a backup plan if it isn't available. But I think what you'll find is that if you look carefully at your processes, there are a lot of places where you're willing to bear. What you're trading off is the optionality that it gives you with the potential for some risk. That's what you've got to weigh. So it's not clear-cut, it's not 100%, but do you want to have optionality or do you want to have certainty? And what's the pro and what's the con and where do you need it and where don't you need it? So those are things you have to start thinking about today, because by 2028, a lot of your work is going to be coordinated. I guess you could say, if you wanted to, your company is going to be Uberized. All your processes will be Uberized. Now, the second thing about planning is that with the environment we live in today, frankly, planning is kind of ridiculous. Now, I grew up doing planning. In fact, the first job I had was making market forecasts about how much of a particular product would be sold 10 years from now, single point forecasts. That doesn't make sense today, and in fact, planning makes much less sense today. Today, it's about the kind of range of uncertainty that you might see. And so we believe very deeply here at the school that rather than, as things get more ambiguous, spending lots and lots of time in debate and internal discussion to try to get buy-in and consensus, which just slows you down, or digging into complexity through endless analysis, again, that can, while it can provide some good insights, can again slow you down, that the very best way to operate today is to try it. Just test it. So we are firm believers that a culture of experimentation, I'm not talking even so much about the experiments themselves in some way, but just getting people to think about, let's try it. Let's figure out a way to test this as a way of approaching decision making is the way you need to think in a complex and ambiguous environment. It has a variety of benefits, of course. One is it kills off what we call hippos. That's highest paid person's opinions. It allows you to stop relying just on gut instinct It encourages more ideas to come forth. I mean, imagine how young people feel if they're constantly, every idea they put forth has to go through endless debate and then gets shot down in the end. Instead, hey, that's a good idea. Let's just try it. So these two reasons, we think, make it very important to cut out as much planning as you can. Here's Bezos saying, our success at Amazon is a function of how many experiments we do per year, per month, per week, per day. That's the secret to success. Try stuff. Break it down, little pieces. Limit the risk and try it. So the suggestions, yeah, planning will still be important for some resources. There'll be some things you'll say, this is so essential that we have exactly this resource at exactly that time. Okay, but it's going to be more expensive in the whole because of the lack of flexibility that it will give you. You're going to replace planning with coordination in many process steps. And again, rather than telling people, be collaborative, design your system in ways that make it possible for people to coordinate among these various pieces within the overall network and make decisions via experimentation. Okay? All right. On to number 3. Got to reorganize. Reorganize, in fact, by task. Companies by 2028 will be largely organized around discrete activities, self-managed projects. So work within organizations will be organized by task because the most important activity we will do will have to do with knowledge, and the natural shape of knowledge is a project. Knowledge is not contained in a physical office. It's not contained in a single functional entity. And so thinking about the project that the knowledge spans is where you want to think about your organizational hub. You all remember, coming out of HR, that the basic lessons of organization is you organize around the most important function. And the most important function in the future will be knowledge. So organizing around projects as your primary and having the others be whatever dotted line you have to have is where you need to go. Now, why do I say this? Well, one reason, frankly, is that I am really tired of working with companies who want me to force fit something you really desperately want to do into a system that really desperately doesn't want to let you do it. I would have to say a big part of my career has been spent working with HR people who say, Tammy, we got to do this, but the system won't let us. Well, people, it's time to get rid of the system because you're going to have to do some things by 2028. One is you're going to have to use older people. And the current systems you have, by and large, make it impossible for you to effectively leverage older workers. I'll talk more about that in a second. Secondly, you're going to have to give young people a lot of variety, a lot of challenge. And the systems you have now are going to make it really tough to keep doing that. And a lot of people want more flexibility. And the systems you have now make that tough. So this will help address those kinds of issues. Organizations around functions and geographies were brilliant in an industrial era. Genius. But they're not right for today for companies where knowledge is going to be the king. So this is an example that talks about the fact that people are going to have a lot of years in retirement. Most of you probably have read the wonderful book by my colleagues Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott about the 100-year life. Well, you guys are going to have a 100-year life. How do you feel about that? Good, good, I'm glad. Well, I have a little bit of bad news. Not all of you are going to make it. And I can't tell you which ones are. But the good news is all of you should plan for it. Every single one of you should be thinking about a 100-year life and what would I do with that glorious 40 years? How am I going to do it? You guys probably aren't, most of you, old enough to have had your kids leave home. But I remember when my kids left home, I was about 2 months into it after my second child had left, and my assistant said to me, Tammy, you have got to tone it down. You are way too happy. I mean, the flood of energy that you feel is unbelievable. So people want to do things in these years, 70s and 80s. They're going to be physically fit, ready to do stuff, and you have to be ready to use them. But they don't want to work 60 hours a week in the jobs that you currently have constructed. That's out. So you've got to construct new jobs. They want to decelerate a little bit over time. They want to do meaningful work, but on a decelerated basis. And the second key point is birth rates are falling. So we're living longer and we're having fewer kids. Let's just pause on that to make sure we're all aligned. Why are we having fewer kids?
It's expensive.
Thank you. That's the honest answer. That's absolutely the honest answer. What are children in an agrarian society? Workers, right. If you were going to create a balance sheet, where would we classify them?
Liability.
No. Come on now. Think. Agrarian. They're assets in an agrarian society, right? Okay, then you jumped ahead. So in an industrial society, they become liabilities, right? Children shift on the great balance sheet of life from asset to liability. And as that happens, we have fewer. I say that simply to point out that there's no expectation that all of a sudden we're going to have more kids. Birth rates fall in a pretty predictable way as economies industrialize. So the logical expectation is we are going to be below replacement levels in terms of numbers of kids in almost every part of the world. Now, what this means is, if you are this poor little chap down here, 5 years old at the bottom of this chart, what kind of a career do you have? You've got all these old people clogging up every conceivable interesting seat in the corporation. That means to give that 5-year-old an interesting career, you have to be able to move them laterally. You have to give them interesting projects, interesting challenges, because you will not be able to promote them to give them enough challenge and variety. And by the way, the UK has it better than many European countries. Here, by the way, is Germany. And as you can see, if you're working in Germany, you've got a really tough challenge. Lots of people clogging it up there. Okay. So you've got to create project-based work. The titles should be time-bound. They should be action-oriented. In other words, you're responsible for launching this product by such and such a date. You have to create bite-sized work options. In other words, create those projects. Start doing that today. Some projects will be short, and some, frankly, will be very long. If you're going to send a rocket to Mars, I would expect that'll take you 10 or 15 years. But some people will take on multiple projects at a time. So imagine a world where you put out a set of projects, and I think to myself, well, I've got a lot of time and energy this year. The kid just left for college. So I'm going to bid on 3 really complicated projects. Or I think to myself, got a lot going on. I'm going to go back to school, get a degree. You offer the projects. I'll bid on them. Now, here's the kicker. Point number 4. Pay me just for what I do. By 2028, a lot of the work that goes on in your organization is going to be paid for based on outcomes. What does that mean? Well, it means that compensation is going to be tied to the project, and you're going to say something like, this project pays this amount, and I'll pay you when you do it. So if I've bid on 3 really difficult projects, I know that I stand to make a lot of money that year. If I bid on 1 simple project, I know that I'm choosing to make less money that year. My choice. So individuals bid on projects. Now, why is this something that I'm up for? Well, a lot of what I help my students in the classroom, the executives in the classroom, think about is how things have changed over time and what we can learn from history. And one thing I feel very strongly is that we can draw an important lesson from looking at craft industries. In fact, I would argue that the way they thought about structuring compensation for craft workers is a reasonable model for much of the work that we're doing today. Think about these silk weavers, famous in Spitalfields here in the UK. The only way that somebody could determine that the silk was worth a lot of money was by what they called the feel of the cloth. That's where the expression came from. So they would feel the cloth and see the beauty of the silk and decide to pay large amounts for that particular output. So think about the knowledge work that goes on in your organization today. How much of it is work that what you can really tell its value is after it's completed, after you've seen it, after you've read it, after you've had an opportunity to interact with it in some way. I often say to people, well, hey, you're welcome to come watch me write a book. I don't know what you'd learn. And a lot of the work that goes on in your organization has that component. It's no longer about a standardized process, as in an industrial world, and it can't be judged based on conformance with process standards. These two ideas, by the way, which came out of Ford and Morris Motors and others, were genius, absolute genius, for a world where the basis of competition was quantity, quality, and cost. These guys nailed it, how to do it. Standardize and judge conformity to standard. That's brilliant. And where you still have parts of your business where quality, quantity, and cost is what you want, keep right on doing this. Absolutely do it. But where the work has a different characteristic, don't try to force fit these rules into this new kind of work. Look for ways where quality, whether it's satisfaction, efficient use of resources, novelty, whatever it is that you judge quality by, can only be judged on completion, and think about paying on that basis. And by the way, stop worrying about hours. The silk weavers didn't care how long it took the women to weave the silk. They paid by the bolt, regardless of the number of hours. That's very analogous to much of the work today. And one more why I'm going to add for this one. Frankly, the whole idea of managing work-life balance is absurd. I have had it with this concept. I've had it with talking about it, and I think it's time for companies to get out of the business. It's not your job to manage my work-life balance. It's your job to give me enough options that I can manage it myself. And that's what you should be thinking about with your people. Turn the issue of creating work-life balance over to the adults that work with you. Give them options. Give them flexibility in choosing or bidding for assignments or projects based on their personal interests and aspirations, and just get out of the head-scratchingly complicated problem of how are you going to correlate pay and flexible arrangements. Done with. Now, you want to think about a variety of arrangements. I think a lot of companies in the transition, for example, will have a base salary, but your bonuses will increasingly be based on the complexity and number of projects that you successfully completed over a period of time. That's how you'll begin to pay people. And I think over time, we're going to see those differentials increase. And more of the work we do will be based very much on completion. You notice the word up there, perhaps, hyper-specialization. This comes from one of Michael's colleagues at MIT, Tom Malone, who I adore. I think his writing is fantastic. And Tom argues that there are a lot of people out there who want to do what they do best. They want to hyper-specialize. And that in many cases in companies, we're asking people by giving them these broad roles. There's about 20% of the role where it's really up my alley. But there's 80% that's kind of, stuff I am not maybe the best served person to do. And so getting more on a project basis allows those of us who want to hyper-specialize to begin to focus more on what we really do well. Fifth point, you need to award badges. you have to hand out a badge. Now, what do I mean by this? Companies are going to compete for talent based on commercially valuable credentials. We talked about purpose, and I absolutely believe in purpose. It's one of my slides as well. I do think you have to have a good purpose, but I don't actually think that's going to be the bottom line decider. I think the bottom line decision is going to be my sense of your impact on my asset value. So it's going to be the idea that if I work with you for a couple of years, I'll be more valuable in the market, or I'll have more options, I'll have more choices, I'll have a broader network. In some way, my asset value will have been enhanced. Why is this important? Well, because basically the idea of security has changed. If I talk to a 60-year-old and ask them about security, most 60-year-olds are going to talk about one company, one job, a pension, etc. That felt secure. If I talk to a 20-year-old and start to mention one company, one job, a 40-year off pension, they think I'm insane. That doesn't feel secure. And if you say to a 20-year-old, what's secure? They're going to say capabilities, experience, skills, knowledge, networks. That's what counts. And so how we get security has changed very substantially. Young people today, yes, they want to feel secure, but they feel secure because they feel better able to compete on the talent market. It means that our career paths have to change. I frankly love the blue career path. Most people my age did. The higher you got to the top, the more power, the more prestige. That's a classic baby boomer career path. But younger people today want something much more like the orange one, where they feel like if they do this job well, there'll be 6 or 8 different directions they could move in. They're not boxed in. They're not limited to one future direction, but they can go in many down the road. By the way, a number of the companies that we interact with here at London Business School are starting. They're creating commercially valuable credentials. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means you've got to be best known as a source of talent for something. Think about General Electric and their reputation for developing leaders in the past. What are you known for? What would I go to your company to raid you for because you're world class at developing somebody with that capability? Maybe with others you want to get together and agree on some task-specific credentials. In other words, I'll just pick one, and I know there are standards for this, but let's say, for example, that several of us got together and said, let's agree on the capabilities that would be embodied in the Project Manager 1 badge. And the reason we'd want to agree on that is because, frankly, you're going to hire my Project Manager 1s, and you want to know that what standard they're meeting. And I'm going to hire your Project Manager 1s, and I want to know that you've certified that they meet a certain standard. You've got to get over this idea of hiding your talent. The future is about labeling your talent. Now, you've got to also develop a rapid ROI approach. We had a group in just last week for executive education who said, our strategy is we train people for 4 years and expect them to stay for 15 more to pay us back. It's not working. I said, yeah, no, it's not going to work. You got to think in 2-year increments. That's kind of my rough rule of thumb. So you should train somebody and get fully paid back to a point that you're happy about it within 2 years. So in 2 years, train me, get paid back, and give me a credential. Now, I might stay with you for many, many, many years, but it would only be because you had a continual flow of those badges. That you said to me, okay, Tammy, after 2 years you earned this badge. If you stay 2 more, you'll get a bigger badge. And if you stay 2 more yet, you'll get yet a bigger badge. And obviously I'm using the word badge a little facetiously, but I do think that's how you want to imagine it. Again, we had a group in recently that decided based on this kind of conversation that they're actually going to financially calculate the expected value of 2 years in their firm on the open market. Now, of course, for the very best of those young people, they anticipate 2 years down the road saying, and if you stay 2 more years, your value will be Z, so they're going to keep the story going, but they're going to attract people based on talking about market value. Decisions about what job to take will increasingly be made based on asset, not cash. And that means you've got to switch from thinking buy to sell. You've got to think about advantages of the role. What does it teach? How does the experience increase the asset value? Will they have more or fewer options if they take this position? And importantly, how well respected are we? Are people wowed if they find out that this person spent 2 years with us? And if the answer is no, that is an immediate priority for you to work on. You better be really well known for something where I'm totally blown away that somebody spent 2 years working with you. 6th point, you're going to need a community. So you're going to need some full-time employees. I totally believe that. Back in my example of, let's say you had 5,000 employees today, I could imagine you'd have 20 or 30,000 community members in the future. And those are the people you need to have your eye on. HR will no longer, 10 years from now, be about managing employees. It will be about managing communities. Your job will be to make sure that you've got this community so that when you want to tap into them, they are signed up and ready to go. Why? Well, because you're going to need the very best talent for every job. I think the most relevant measure in the future is going to be fit for purpose. Basically, I'm totally tired of the measure retention rates. I find that whenever people say that, my instinct is always to say, well, okay, so you've had somebody stay with you for 29 years who's been mediocre. I mean, how do I know they've been good? What I really want to know is they've been the best person you could tap into. What kind of fit for purpose metrics do you have? And so human resources has to begin to think like a talent agency for the film studios. Do you remember back in the 1920s and 30s, film studios actually employed the actors and actresses? People like Marilyn Monroe were employees, full-time employees, which meant that when a studio went to make a movie, they didn't have a choice. They had to have Marilyn Monroe play every single role, whether somebody else would be better or not. That's the situation you're stuck in, and you got to get out of it. That's not to say Marilyn Monroe isn't great, but she's not great for everything. And you've got some great employees, but they're not great for everything. So you need to begin to think about, how do I pull the best people for what my situation is? Facilitate hyper-specialization and think like a platform. Again, bite-sized, codified, curated, rated, all of that becomes your job in terms of effectively deploying people. Another why, of course, is the technology. This one's pretty obvious. It simply allows us to tap people anywhere. So we need to expect that. People will work anywhere, anytime. This story about Schneider Electric with people all around the world, that's a big part of what you'll gather if you think in this community way. And here's one of the big benefits: innovation. I've done a lot of work looking at innovative companies, and if I had to pick one definition of innovation, the simplest definition, I would say it is combining two ideas that have never before been combined. Now think about that for a minute. There are two ways you can do that. I've actually studied major inventions, and it turns out there are inventions that were created by one human being. But those human beings tended to have really eclectic backgrounds. They studied multiple disciplines. They had very different, varied experiences. And somehow out of this can of worms that runs around in their minds, they were able to pull out these different ideas and fuse them together. That's not sustainable in companies. In companies, the sustainable approach to putting two ideas together is to have different people with different ideas and let them talk to each other. And to have a community where you're not getting stuck with having just the same people talking over and over, but you're bringing people in at varieties and infusing new sense and new thinking into projects. So communities play a very important part in one of the most important challenges we face, which is to be innovative. What do you need to do? Well, you've got to embrace a wide range of people, wide range of ages, backgrounds, all kinds of things, and find a way to make an inclusive community where they're all listened to. 7. So engagement has probably been either your favorite word or your least favorite word for the last decade or so. It certainly has been something that has dominated the HR community. I've done a fair amount of research on engagement, and here's what I can tell you. The companies with the highest levels of engagement are weird. That's the truth. They are not average. They are idiosyncratic. They have things they do that are unique to them. They don't try to be all things to all people. In fact, if I can find a senior executive who'll say this, not everyone would want to work at my company. I know I'm home free, because this is a company that's begun to have a feel for what they're good at and what they're not, what they offer and what they don't. And that's the secret to engagement. It's about really conveying the uniqueness of your work environment, something that's differentiating and meaningful, a brand that will extend between and among the episodes of work. Why is that important? Well, the panel before said it. We don't all want the same things from work. That's quite clear. There are lots of different things. Some of us really want to get rich. That's highly important. I did some work with a government agency not too long ago, and just before I was going to go on, they came up and said, Tammy, our salary cap has been raised by 5%. And I said, okay, well, that's nice, but I'm now going to go on and say that doesn't matter. And my point was, I doubt any people in this government agency had chosen to work there because of money. I mean, frankly, if they had, you got a whole nother problem. They may have chosen security or they may have chosen impact, but the thing that grabbed them was not, I'm going to get rich working for this government agency. You've got to understand, what is it that grabs people in your organization? Did they come for the money? Did they come for the security? Did they come for the community or the impact? Did they come for the social environment? What is it? And the model that we teach and use is called Purpose, Promise, Delivery. And the most important place, I think, to start is in the middle with promise. You've got to understand, what do people have in their heads that they think you promised when they joined your organization? And then the second question is, are you delivering it? And if that's not possible, the third question is, how can you re-articulate your purpose to send a clearer and better signal about the promise that would work for you? And by the way, this is equally applicable to customers and employees. So you must have a differentiated promise, and it must be expressed through a compelling purpose. Okay, do what robots can't do. That's pretty obvious, I guess. But the point is, I am an optimist. Michael said he was almost an optimist or a partial optimist. I don't know. I'm a pretty big optimist. I think there's going to be a lot of new jobs created. As he said, robots are going to have to be calibrated and worked with. But they're going to be different jobs. And robots are going to do my job. And they're going to do a lot of your jobs. And we've got to accept that and get ready for the future. I did some work looking at different types of knowledge work and trying to understand where robots would have the biggest impact. And when you look at things like sharing expertise, I think robots will do a lot of that. When you look at things like assessing and recommending, like doctors and lawyers, robots are going to do a lot of that. But when you think about deciding, that means choosing among equally viable or equally rational options. Things about values, choices. I don't think they'll do that. I think we'll have a role there. And when you think about relationships, connections, this whole fundamental idea of how you bring things together for innovative insights, I think we'll have a role there. So those are the kind of things that I would suggest we focus on developing in our people and in ourselves as we get ready to work with robots down the road. Now, everything I've said in some ways hinges on this, and I almost thought, boy, I should have started with this one. Maybe I should have. But I loved Heinz's point. He made a point in the panel that you have to focus. And when I look back on history, I want to say two things. One is, any notion you have that we're living in a time of unprecedented change, I don't agree with, personally. I think it's rubbish. When I look back in history at the change that occurred in the 1600s to the traders when the Royal Exchange was built here in London, and trading moved out of their homes and into a central location, boy, it sure feels very similar to the internet in terms of the change in information asymmetry. When I look at the silk weavers and the onslaught of mechanical, technical capabilities, it feels a lot like the looming sense of robots and AI. When I look at automobile manufacturing, which, by the way, all through World War I was done by hand craft-based assembly, and how it was decimated in just a couple of years when the assembly line came on. Hundreds of automobile manufacturers out of business overnight when Morris and Ford put in their assembly lines. And who's won? The people who figured out the best new business model, the best new approach, the best new leadership. The people who invented a new way to do it, and they did it by focusing on the most important thing. Morris, for example, knew that what he wanted to do was make a lot of cars at a consistent quality, and he put his brain to thinking about all the organizational and management processes you could imagine to facilitate that single goal. Now, did he have other goals like, design and, marketing and all that stuff? Yeah, I'm sure he did. But what he did really well was quantity, quality, and cost. He focused on that. And that's your challenge today. Are you going to still have to make stuff quantity, quality, cost? Yes, some of you, many of you will. But delegate that. Delegate that down to the next level. And make sure your senior leaders are focusing on the most important question, which is, how are we going to mobilize intelligence? What do I mean by that? Well, I mean a lot of things. I mean innovation. I mean figuring out how to collaborate. I mean figuring out how to sense, figuring out how to tap the right resources at the right time, how to disaggregate the data into ways that are valuable. But I firmly believe that the highest value in your business will be your ability to mobilize intelligence. Why do I say that? Well, I think it's really this century's opportunity to excel. So here's another of my heroes. This is Peter Drucker. I actually had the great privilege of knowing Peter. What a guy, unbelievable. And this is something he said 30 years ago. He pointed out that the big deal in the last century was to do manufacturing productivity. But 30 years ago, he told us that the big deal in this century was going to be about knowledge. In other words, we probably more or less have wrung what we can out of manufacturing efficiency. The idea that an iconic company will emerge because they've figured out how to do quantity, quality, and cost step change better is unlikely. Impossible? Maybe not impossible, but unlikely. The sense that a great company will emerge because they've figured out new ways to leverage intelligence, that's where the opportunity lies. And here's the thing about it, and the panel actually used, I think, almost exactly this word. It's discretionary. People have to want to do it. They've got to think. And so here's the really scary thing. Your future depends on something over which you have no control. It depends on people's willingness to invest discretionary effort and to think. You got to accept that. And that brings me to my very last point, which is what do we do as leaders? So most of what I've talked about up to now is about changing the organization. How do we change ourselves? Well, if you look in the dictionary, you would get a definition of a leader that kind of feels like this red fish. Out in front, leading the way, everybody's in line behind them, they know where they're going, got it all sorted out. I don't think that's leadership today. And I think that's a good thing because I think that's hard to do. I think leadership today is about creating context. It's rather than being out front, it's about creating an environment for others. And why do I say that? Well, basically, common sense practicality. There's simply no other way to mobilize intelligence because it can't be forced. You heard Michael talk about the clevers. If you tell a clever person, I insist that you innovate, that's going to go over like a lead balloon, yeah. It can't be required. Oh, you could hire me and say, Tammy, I've hired you to innovate. I would say to you, I innovated really hard all week long. I didn't come up with anything, but boy, I gave it my best. What do you know? You have no idea. You won't even know if I'm giving it my very best shot. You can lead that horse to water, but you'll never get them to drink. So what can you do? A leader can create a context. You have to move from the idea that leaders motivate talented people by dangling a carrot to one that says leaders create an environment where talented people choose to work. That's your job. Create an environment where talented people get excited and choose to be part of it. And here are the 4 things that I believe are critical to that. The first is, as leaders, you should be disruptive. Leaders' jobs are to ensure that there's a continual infusion of fresh air in the organization. There are lots of ways you can do it. Send people out, bring people in, whatever, but be disruptive. A leader's job is not to have the answers, it's to have the questions. You've got to ask great questions. And by the way, how do we increase sales by 3% is not a great question. That doesn't qualify. Great, intriguing questions that I'm interested in solving, that's what will work. Leaders need to connect people and make it easy for people to connect. You can't force me to collaborate any more than you can force me to innovate. But you can make it easy for me to do it when and where I choose to do it. And that's a leader's job. And finally, you have to engage me through a compelling purpose. Just as the panel said, you must have a purpose that leads to a promise, and you have to make sure your organization delivers 110% on that promise. That's a leader's role today. That's what we teach here at the school, those kinds of skills and characteristics as we think about the future. And I appreciate all of you listening to me race through these today. Thank you.